My name is Claire Whitfield, and I am 38 years old. 6 weeks ago, at my nephew's 9th birthday party, my sister Denise stood up in front of 11 relatives and 4 of her book club friends, held up her mimosa, and said, "Let's be honest, if Claire ever gets married, the man is either a saint or he's never met her before 10 a.m. Everyone laughed. My mother laughed hardest, the way she always does, like she's been waiting all week for permission. My father, standing by the grill in the apron he's had for 3 summers, didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either, which by now I understood to be its own familiar kind of quiet. I laughed too, because that's the job I'd had in this family for 5 years running, the one who laughs at herself before anyone else gets the chance to do it for her. What none of them knew, standing in that backyard with paper streamers and a bounce house payment plan Denise was still making, was that 4 days earlier I had turned down an acquisition offer for my company worth $11 million. And 3 weeks after that birthday party, my sister's husband was going to call me, not as family, but as a stranger begging an expert for help, and he was going to have absolutely no idea whose number he was dialing. Before I take you further into this one, if you're the kind of person who's ever been the family joke, the built-in punchline nobody asked you to audition for, I want you to stay with me on this, because this story does not end the way you think it does. If a story like this has ever felt like your own life, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me the exact phrase your family used on you, the one that got repeated so many times it stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like your name. I'll be reading those. Let me take you back 6 years, to a kitchen in Cedar Hollow, Ohio, a town of about 4,300 people with one stoplight, one diner called the Miller's Table, and a Lutheran church that everyone in my family attended except me. My father, Frank Whitfield, spent 31 years driving routes for a regional freight company. Same shift, same steel-toed boots he replaced every February like clockwork. My mother, Judy, kept the house and kept score, though she'd never have called it that. She has sat in the 3rd pew from the front at that Lutheran church every Sunday for as long as I've been alive. And I don't think it's an accident that the story she liked telling about our family, married daughter, 2 grandchildren, a son-in-law with a title, was also the story that played best in that pew, among the same women who'd ask her, every week without fail, whether the older one had found anyone yet. My mother's love for Denise's version of a life was never really about Denise. It was about a story she could tell at coffee hour without having to explain anything. Denise is 2 years younger than me, and she has always been the daughter my parents understood. She got married at 24 to a man named Mark Delacroix, a compliance officer at a mid-sized manufacturing firm, and from that day forward, every Thanksgiving table in Cedar Hollow reorganized itself around the fact that Denise had done the thing daughters are supposed to do and I had not. I was the one who liked computers instead of dances. I fixed the church's donor database for free when I was 19 because Pastor Whitlock's laptop kept crashing during tithe season, and my mother's only comment was that it was a shame all that time on a machine when I could have been meeting someone at the county fair like Denise had. That same summer, I taught myself basic scripting from library books because Cedar Hollow's one computer store didn't stock anything past introductory manuals, and I remember my father finding me at the kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by printouts, and asking, not unkindly but not really curious either, whether I was still doing that homework thing, 3 months after the school year had already ended. I studied computer science at a state school 2 hours away, paid for almost entirely by a scholarship nobody in my family ever mentioned at a single holiday dinner, not once, not even the year I made the dean's list 4 semesters running. Denise's engagement announcement, the same autumn, got a 2-page spread in my mother's photo album with a ribbon glued to the corner. I want to introduce you here to the one person in Cedar Hollow who never made me feel like an unfinished project. My Aunt Rosalind, Ro, everyone called her, was my mother's older sister, and she lived 40 minutes away in a rented duplex with a garden she was proud of and a phone she answered on the first ring, every single Sunday at 6 p.m., for as long as I can remember. Ro never asked me when I was getting married. She asked what I was building. When I got my first real job doing incident response for a regional bank at 24, making $41,000 a year, Ro sent a card with a $10 bill folded inside it and a note that said, "Buy something ugly and impractical. You earned it." I still have that card. It's the only physical thing from those years I kept. The rupture, the moment that set the tone for the next decade, happened at my cousin's wedding, the summer I was 32. Denise had been married 8 years by then, had 2 kids, and had appointed herself the unofficial mistress of ceremonies at every family function whether anyone asked her to or not. She'd worn a pale green dress she'd mentioned twice, cost her almost $300. "Because it's a wedding, Claire, you don't cut corners on a wedding," which was its own small joke at my expense since I'd bought mine off a clearance rack for $31 and been perfectly happy with it. During the reception, a second cousin I barely knew asked me kindly enough if I was seeing anyone. Before I could answer, Denise leaned across the table laughing and said the sentence that would follow me for the next 5 years. "Claire's too difficult for any man to keep. She corrects people's grammar on a first date. It's a medical condition at this point." The table laughed. 9 people, I counted later without meaning to, the way you count a room after something in it changes. My mother laughed. My father looked at his plate and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and which I want you to remember because it matters later. Only one person at that table, an elderly great-uncle I barely knew, didn't laugh. He just looked at me for a second too long, like he felt bad and didn't know what to do about it, and then went back to his cake. I didn't correct her. I didn't defend myself. I finished my chicken, I complimented the cake, and I drove the 2 hours home in silence, and somewhere on that drive I stopped waiting for my family to notice me and started building something they couldn't see. I should tell you a little more about where that instinct came from because it didn't start at that wedding. It started long before, in small specific ways nobody in my family would ever describe as a pattern, because no single one of them looks like much on its own. When I was 17, I won a regional science fair for a piece of software I'd written to help the Miller's table track its inventory without wasting food, and my mother's only comment, reading the certificate over my shoulder, was to ask whether I'd worn something nice to the awards dinner, because Denise's junior prom photos were due back from the developer that same week, and she wanted them side by side in the album. When I got into my computer science program on a scholarship that covered 90% of tuition, my father shook my hand once, briskly, the way he'd shake a coworker's hand, and asked whether the computer thing would still let me come home for the holidays. Denise's engagement the following autumn got a 2-page spread with a ribbon glued to the corner, like I mentioned, but I want you to understand the actual contrast. My scholarship letter never made it into that album at all. I found it, 11 years later, still folded in the box where my mother kept old bills. If you've ever done that, quietly stop performing for people who are never going to clap. I need you to comment below and tell me what year it was for you because I promise you, someone reading this is going to recognize themselves in your answer. And if this story is worth your time, consider subscribing now, because what happens over the next 5 years is the part nobody in my family saw coming, including me. I am a digital forensic specialist by training and, eventually, a founder by circumstance. My work is logs and timestamps and audit trails, proving, to a legally defensible standard, exactly what happened, in exactly what order and who touched what and when. It is a profession built entirely on documentation, because in my field, an unsupported claim is worthless, and a claim with a timestamp is evidence. I did not choose to become a person who keeps records because I was suspicious of my family. I became a person who keeps records because it is how I have made a living since I was 24, and eventually, without ever quite deciding to, I started applying that same instinct to my own life. Not as a weapon, quote, as a habit, the way an electrician notices faulty wiring in a friend's house without meaning to. 6 years ago, at 32, 4 months after that wedding, I left the bank and started a small security consultancy out of a spare bedroom with $8,000 of my own savings and one client, a regional credit union that needed someone to audit their breach response after a phishing incident cost them $211,000. I named the company Northline Security after a fire road near the cabin Roe used to rent every August, the one place in my childhood that had never once made me feel like the wrong kind of daughter. I sold my car that first year, an old but reliable sedan, and drove a 15-year-old hand-me-down from Roe instead, just to keep 3 more months of runway in the business account. I told my family none of this. When my mother asked what I did for work, I said computers, the same flat non-answer I'd been giving since I was 20, and she never asked a follow-up question because in her mind, the subject had already been closed for years. Denise never asked at all. Year 1 of Northline was brutal in the ordinary way small businesses are brutal. I worked from 6 in the morning until midnight most days. I had one employee, a former Air Force cyber analyst named Priya Nair, who believed in the company before it had any right to be believed in, and I paid her before I paid myself for the first 14 months. By the end of that year, we had 3 clients and $44,000 in the bank, which felt, at the time, like the entire world. I told no one in my family. At Thanksgiving that November, Denise announced she was pregnant with her second child, and the dinner conversation revolved around nursery colors for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I counted, the way I count things. Somewhere around the 90-minute mark, my mother turned to me and asked if I was still doing the freelance computer stuff, in the same tone she might use to ask if I'd gotten over a cold, and I said yes, and that was the entirety of the interest anyone at that table showed in the thing I had built my whole life around that year. That same fall, I spoke on a panel at a regional cybersecurity conference in Columbus, 40 minutes from Cedar Hollow, about small business breach response, and a photo from that panel ran in the conference's own recap newsletter, which had maybe 600 subscribers, none of them, as far as I knew, related to me. I remember standing at that podium thinking, with a strange, private clarity, that this was the first room in my adult life where nobody was going to ask me a single question about my dating status, and it felt like breathing with a window open after years in a closed car. Ro called that same week, the way she always did, 6 o'clock on the dot, and asked one question my mother never had. Is it actually going to make it, Claire, or are you just telling yourself that because you're too stubborn to say it's hard? I told her the truth, that I genuinely didn't know yet, that Priya and I were splitting a single desk lamp between 2 card tables in my spare bedroom, that I'd eaten cereal for dinner 4 nights that week to keep the business account solvent. Ro didn't tell me it would be fine. She said, then keep going until you do know, and mailed me a check for $200 the following Tuesday with a note that said it wasn't a loan, it was a bet, and she expected to collect on it in stories, not money. I never cashed that check. I still have it, in the same drawer as the card for my first job. Year 2, Northline picked up a contract with a hospital network after a ransomware incident locked their patient records for 9 days, and word started to travel in the narrow circle of people who care about that kind of work. We grew to 6 employees. I bought a modest townhouse 40 minutes outside Cedar Hollow with cash I'd saved, told my mother I'd gotten a good rate, and let her assume what she wanted, which was that I'd overextended myself the way she always assumed I would. That was also the year Ro's knees got bad enough that she needed help getting groceries in from the car, and I started driving out on Wednesdays after work, every single week, rain or not, because that's what Ro had done for me every Sunday since I was a child, and I was not going to let her sit alone with a bad hip and a full pantry list. That same year, at Christmas, Denise mentioned, almost as an aside while unwrapping a gift, that she'd heard from a mutual friend that I'd bought someplace, and asked, half joking, whether I needed a man to co-sign it since banks don't usually just hand houses to single women. I told her I'd paid cash. She laughed like I'd made a joke, because in her mind, there was no other explanation that made sense. That was also the year my parents' 35th wedding anniversary came around, and Denise took charge of planning the party the way she always did. Assigning tasks over a group text, she'd handle the venue, our cousin would handle the cake, Wendy would handle decorations. I got assigned nothing, and when I asked, lightly, if there was anything I could help with, Denise wrote back, "Don't worry about it, it's more of a family with kids thing, you wouldn't really get the vibe we're going for." I read that message standing in Northline's server closet at 11 at night, running a diagnostic on a client's backup system, and I remember thinking that it was a strange thing to be told by a woman who had never once asked what my vibe even was. Year 3 was the year everything tipped. A regional logistics company hired Northline after discovering an insider had been quietly siphoning shipment data to a competitor for 11 months, and the case became, in a small industry conference kind of way, a name people knew. We found the leak in 6 days. Traced through a pattern of after-hours file transfers to a personal email address, and the company's CEO, a blunt man named Harlan who ran the place his father had started, told Priya afterward that he'd expected some big consulting firm with a fancy deck, and instead gotten 2 women who actually read the logs instead of talking around them, which he meant, I think, as the highest compliment he had in him. Northline grew to 14 employees. Revenue crossed $1.9 million. And that same year, at Easter, Denise made the joke again, a variation this time, Claire's married to her laptop. At least the laptop doesn't complain about her personality. My mother laughed so hard she had to set down her fork. My father, again, said nothing, and looked, I noticed for the first time, faintly uncomfortable in a way that hadn't been there the first time. That was also the Easter my cousin Wendy, who was maybe 22 then and dating nobody yet, pulled me aside by the drink cooler and said quietly, "I don't think that's funny, what she says about you. I just never know what to say when everyone else is laughing." I told her she didn't owe me a rescue at every family dinner, but I remember exactly what she was wearing, a yellow cardigan with a coffee stain on the cuff, because it was the first time in 3 years anyone under that roof besides Ro had said out loud that the joke wasn't actually funny. I want you to hold on to Wendy for a minute because she matters again later, in a way neither of us could have predicted that afternoon by the cooler. If you've ever had one person at the table who quietly didn't laugh, who never said much, but never joined in either, I want to hear about them. Comment below and tell me who that person was for you, because I think we don't thank those people enough, and this is as good a place as any to start. I want to pause here for a second, because I think this is the part people skip past too fast. It would have been easy, that Easter, to stand up and tell them what Northline was worth by then. It would have taken maybe 90 seconds. I didn't do it, and it wasn't because I was ashamed, and it wasn't because I was saving it up like a weapon for later, even though it might look that way from the outside now. I didn't do it because somewhere in year 2 I had quietly stopped needing them to know. That's a different thing than hiding. Hiding is done out of fear. What I was doing, by year 3, was simply living a life that no longer required their approval to feel real, and if you've never experienced that particular kind of peace, I hope this story gives you a taste of it, because it is worth more than any apology I was ever owed. If that line means something to you. If you've ever built a life quietly, on purpose, away from people who never earned the right to watch you do it, I'd genuinely like to know. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching this from and what time it is right now where you are. I read everyone, and it helps me know how far this story is traveling. Year 4 is when the outside world started noticing Northline before my own family did. We landed a contract auditing security controls for a state pension system, then a follow-on piece of work for a Fortune 500 retailer after a card skimming breach. A trade publication called Dark Reading ran a 600-word profile on founders under 40 reshaping mid-market cybersecurity, and my photo was in it, alongside 2 other founders, none of whom anyone in Cedar Hollow would ever read about, because nobody in Cedar Hollow reads Dark Reading. Northline crossed 26 employees and $4.4 million in annual revenue that year. I bought Ro a stairlift for her duplex without telling my mother where the money came from, and when my mother asked how Ro had suddenly afforded a stairlift on a fixed income, I said Ro had found a good financing plan, and my mother nodded and moved on, because it had genuinely never once occurred to her to wonder whether it was me. That same year, Priya and I hired our first real office manager, a retired school teacher named Deb who kept a bowl of butterscotch candies on her desk and insisted on learning every employee's coffee order by the end of their first week, and it was Deb, watching me field a call from my mother one afternoon and hang up looking smaller than I usually let myself look at the office, who said, without prying further, "You know, you don't have to earn the right to be proud of this place. It's already earned." I didn't answer her that day. I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. I want to tell you a little about Priya here, because she shows up a lot in this story and I don't want her to stay a name without a shape. She'd spent 6 years in the Air Force doing signals analysis before she left to raise her younger brother after their parents died within 8 months of each other. And she joined Northline in year 1 for less money than she could have made anywhere else because, she told me once over the world's worst office coffee, I wanted to build something with someone who actually reads the whole report instead of just the summary. We have never once, in 6 years, had a conversation about whether either of us was married. It has simply never come up because neither of us has ever needed it to be the measure of the other's worth. That, it turns out, is a remarkably restful way to be known by another person, and I didn't fully understand how rare it was until I compared it, one Thanksgiving, to an entire dinner table that had spent an hour discussing my sister's youngest child's sleep schedule without once asking what case I'd closed that week. Year 5. The year all of this comes to a head, opened with an $11 million acquisition offer from a company called Farrell Point Holdings, a private equity-backed consolidator buying up boutique security firms across the Midwest. I turned it down. Not because the number was insulting. It wasn't. It was generous, and Priya, by then my chief operating officer, thought I was out of my mind for saying no. But because I had built something I still wanted to run, and $11 million was not, it turned out, the thing I had been building toward. I sat with that number for 4 days before I gave Farrell Point my answer, running it against every version of my life I could imagine on either side of that decision, and what settled it, in the end, was a strange, small thought that had nothing to do with money at all. I did not want to spend the next chapter of my life explaining Northline to a new set of owners the way I'd spent the last 5 explaining nothing to my own family. That decision happened on a Tuesday in early April. 4 days later was my nephew's 9th birthday party, the one I opened this story with, where Denise stood up with a mimosa and told a yard full of relatives that I was too difficult for any man to keep. I laughed along, like I said. But something had shifted by then, quietly, without my even noticing it shift, and it showed up 3 weeks later in the strangest possible way, a group chat screenshot forwarded to me by accident. Here's how it happened. My cousin Wendy, who is close with Denise and who had recently started dating a man who worked in supply chain compliance, had been added to a family group chat called Whitfield Crew that I was technically still in, but that I muted permanently in year 2 of Northline because I got tired of scrolling past photos of Denise's kids captioned with things I wasn't part of. That chat had, at various points, hosted a running debate about whether I'd ever bring a +1 to Christmas, a poll about whether I'd forgotten my own niece's birthday 2 years running. I hadn't. I'd simply stopped being told the party had moved locations, and, once, A 2-day thread analyzing whether a coworker I'd mentioned once, in passing, at a barbecue 3 years earlier, might be the one. A coworker I have not spoken to since he left Northline for a job in Seattle. I muted it because none of that thread was ever really about me. It was about the story the family wanted to tell about me, running in the background whether or not I was watching. Wendy meant to forward a message from that chat to her boyfriend. She sent it to me instead by a wrong tap, the kind of mistake that happens to everyone once or twice in their life and that, in this case, happened to change everything. The screenshot was a message from Denise, sent to my mother and 2 aunts 11 days before Wendy's mistake. It read, "Guys, I found something wild. Claire's company, the security one, got written up in some tech magazine. It says 4-point-something million in revenue last year. Or million. I looked her up on LinkedIn and she has like 30 employees. She never said ON word about any of this." My mother had replied, "Well, that explains the townhouse." An aunt had replied, "Do you think she'd help with Mark's thing at work? He's been so stressed." Denise had replied to that one, "Maybe. Worth asking. She's a numbers person. She'll probably like feeling important." I read that message 4 times. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because this genre of story sometimes pretends the protagonist feels nothing but cool detachment, and that isn't true, and I don't think it's useful to pretend otherwise. What I felt, first, was a flash of something hot and old, a feeling I hadn't let myself feel since I was 32 years old at a wedding, eating chicken in silence. But under that, almost immediately, was something colder and more familiar, the same instinct I bring to every incident response case I've ever worked: don't react. The document. I took a screenshot of the screenshot, time-stamped in my own case notes the way I'd log any piece of evidence, and I told exactly one person, Priya, over coffee the next morning, and then I did the thing my profession has trained into me for 14 years. I waited. The aunt named in that group chat, my mother's youngest sister Pam, actually called me the same week, before Wendy's mistake, though I didn't yet know what had prompted it. She asked, in a roundabout way that I now recognize as phishing, whether Northline did the kind of thing where you find out if someone's stealing from a company, because she'd heard some things and thought I might know people in that world. I told her, truthfully at the time, that Northline did exactly that kind of work, and she said, "Oh, interesting, I'll keep that in mind," and hung up without ever telling me why she was asking, which struck me as odd enough to note down at the time, though I didn't understand its full shape until Wendy's forward arrived 11 days later and connected every piece at once. 2 days later, Wendy called me directly, mortified, to apologize for the wrong number forward, and in the course of that call she mentioned, without meaning to hand me anything at all, that Denise had also texted her separately, asking whether Wendy's boyfriend, the one in supply chain compliance, knew anyone good with computer forensic stuff, because Mark's company has some kind of situation. That was the confirmation I needed. It wasn't one careless message anymore, it was a pattern, a family already quietly triangulating toward my expertise from 2 different directions at once, while still discussing me, behind my back, as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be asked directly. In my line of work, 1 data point is an anomaly. 2 independent data points pointing the same direction is a finding. I did not confront Denise. I did not call my mother. I did not, and this matters, go looking for a fight. What I did was consult, quietly, with an attorney I'd worked with on 2 prior corporate matters, not to build a case against my family. There was no case to build, they hadn't broken any law, only my patience. But to make sure that whatever came next, whatever Mark's thing at work turned out to be, I would be walking into it with my own professional and financial position fully protected, on my terms, from a position of complete clarity. That is not revenge. That is just how I was trained to survive. I spent an hour that same week with our attorney reviewing Northline's conflict of interest policy line by line, the same policy I'd make any new client sign off on before we opened a single log file, because I wanted to know before anyone else asked whether accepting work connected to my own brother-in-law's employer would compromise the integrity of any findings we produced. It wouldn't, as long as the engagement stayed arm's length and the fee structure stayed standard, and I made a note of that conclusion, the same way I'd note any other scoping decision, dated and filed, in case anyone ever asked me to account for it later. Nobody ever did. But I have long since stopped doing important things without a paper trail, even the ones nobody will ever read. Before we get to the boardroom, because I know that's the part you've really been waiting for, if you've made it this far into a story about being underestimated for 5 straight years, I'd bet you've got your own version of the moment where the family found out what you'd actually been building. Type it in the comments. I want this thread to be full of them by the time this video's done. 3 weeks after Wendy's accidental forward on a Tuesday morning at 9:47, my office phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, area code local to the county, and a man's voice on the other end introduced himself as Mark Delacroix, compliance officer at Halloran Manufacturing, and said he'd gotten my name from a colleague in the industry who'd recommended Northline Security for a sensitive internal matter. He did not recognize my voice. He did not, in that first call, connect the name Claire Whitfield to his own wife's maiden name, because in 5 years of marriage, Mark Delacroix had never once, to my knowledge, heard my full professional title said out loud in a room where he was paying attention. Stay with me here, because this is the part I know you've been waiting for, and I promise it's worth the 30 seconds it takes to hit subscribe before we get into it, if you haven't already. Because what happened in that boardroom 3 days later is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Halloran Manufacturing, it turned out, was in the middle of an internal investigation into a data exfiltration event that had been quietly bleeding proprietary formulas and supplier contracts to a competitor for at least 14 months. The company's outside counsel had recommended bringing in an independent digital forensics firm before the board escalated the matter to federal authorities, because if this went to litigation, they needed a forensic chain of custody that would hold up, and Mark, as compliance officer, had been tasked with finding that firm. He had gotten Northline's name from a former colleague who'd worked with us on the logistics case in year 3. He set up an initial scoping call for the following Monday at 10 in the morning in Halloran's own boardroom and asked, over email, whether Miss part of the word, C. Whitfield, could attend in person given the sensitivity of the matter. In the 3 days between that scoping email and the meeting itself, I found myself thinking more than once about all the versions of this moment I might have imagined for myself at 32, driving home from that wedding in silence. I never once pictured it happening in a boardroom over an insider threat case with my sister's husband on the other side of the table. I had pictured, if I'd pictured anything at all, some quieter kind of vindication, a headline maybe, or a number my mother would eventually stumble across on her own. What I got instead was stranger and, in its own way, more useful, a professional engagement that had nothing to do with my family and everything to do with the fact that I was simply good at my job, arriving at the exact moment my family needed that fact more than they'd ever needed to understand it. I said yes. I did not, in that email exchange, mention that I had eaten Thanksgiving dinner across the table from this man's wife 22 times in the last 11 years. I did not mention it because it was, professionally, irrelevant to the scoping call, and I want to be honest about this part too. Some quiet, unhurried part of me wanted to watch him find out in real time. Monday morning, I walked into Halloran's lobby at 9:52, 6 minutes early, the way I walk into every client meeting. The receptionist, an older woman with a nameplate that read Denise, of all things, a small, unrelated coincidence that made me smile despite everything, noticed the Northline logo on my laptop bag and said, "Oh, you're the forensics team." Everyone upstairs has been so nervous about this meeting, but if you're half as sharp as your write-up sounded, you're going to make their week. It was such a small, ordinary kindness, offered by someone with absolutely no idea what was about to happen one floor above her, and it settled something in me before I even stepped into the elevator. I walked into the boardroom itself at 9:58, 2 minutes early, with Priya beside me carrying the intake folder in a laptop bag, and I watched Mark Delacroix's face do something I have only seen a handful of times in 14 years of this work, the specific, total collapse of a man's assumptions happening in real time, in front of witnesses, with nowhere for it to go. Please stood up. He said, "Claire, the way you say a word you don't believe is real." I said, "Mark, good to see you." 4 seconds passed. I counted them, the way I count everything, an old habit from 100 depositions. Nobody in that room but the two of us understood what those 4 seconds meant. He recovered the way compliance officers are trained to recover, which is to say, badly, but with effort. He said something about how he had no idea, and that he'd gotten the referral through a completely separate channel, and that this was a genuinely wild coincidence, and I let him finish because interrupting a nervous man rarely gets you anything useful, and because I was, in that moment, doing my actual job, which was assessing whether a conflict of interest existed that would compromise the integrity of the engagement. Professionally, it did not. I had never had a financial or personal relationship with Halloran Manufacturing, and Mark and I, whatever our family entanglement, had no direct financial relationship with each other either. I told him this, flatly, the way I'd tell any client. There's no conflict here that prevents me from doing this work correctly. But you should know that I know exactly who told your wife's family what my revenue was last year, and I know exactly what she said about me when she thought I'd be flattered to be asked. The room went quiet. Priya, beside me, did not say a word and did not need to. Her presence there, Steady, professional, entirely unbothered by the family drama unfolding in front of her, did more to settle that room than anything either Mark or I could have said. That's the thing about a good business partner who has watched you build something from nothing. They don't need to speak. Their calm is the argument. Mark asked what I meant. Later, Charmin, I told him. I read it back to him almost exactly the way I'd log a finding in an incident report, factual, dated, in order, no editorializing. 3 weeks ago, your wife found an article about my company's revenue. She told my mother it explained the townhouse. Your aunt-in-law asked if I'd help with, quote, Mark's thing at work, because, and I'm quoting this part exactly, I'm a numbers person who would, quote, probably like feeling important. That was the plan. Not asking me directly, as a professional, for a scoping call. Asking me indirectly, as a family favor, because nobody in that conversation thought my actual expertise was worth naming out loud. 4 seconds again. This time, I didn't need to count them. I felt them. Mark sat back down slowly. He said, and this is the one moment I want you to remember, because every antagonist in a story like this gets exactly one moment where the performance drops and something true gets through. I didn't know any of that. I swear to you, Claire, I didn't know they were talking about you like that. Denise mentioned her sister did something with computers, and I thought, worth a shot. I didn't think. He stopped. He put his hand over his mouth for a second, an involuntary gesture, the kind you can't fake in a boardroom at 10 in the morning with your own compliance counsel sitting 3 feet away. Then, just as quickly, he straightened up and said, but this is a real crisis for the company. I'm asking you professionally, whatever's happened in the family, can we separate that from this? That is the retreat. That is the exact moment where a person who has had one honest second goes right back to protecting the more comfortable version of events. And I want to be clear with you, I did not hold that against him the way I would hold it against Denise, because Mark is not the primary reason I'm telling you this story. Mark is the enforcer, not the architect. He said yes to whatever Denise proposed the same way he'd said yes to every family dynamic he'd married into for 11 years, without asking a single hard question. That is a real failure. It is not the same failure as standing up at a birthday party with a mimosa in your hand and choosing, on purpose, in front of 11 witnesses, to make your sister the punchline. I told Mark that Northline would take the engagement because it was, professionally, a case worth taking. A 14-month exfiltration event with real financial exposure deserved a serious forensic response regardless of who was sitting across the table from me. And because turning it down out of spite would have made the family drama bigger than the actual work, which is exactly the kind of imbalance I have spent 5 years training myself out of. I told him one condition, and I said it once, flatly, the way you state a term in a contract, this stays a professional engagement. My fee schedule, my scope, my findings, delivered to your board and your outside counsel exactly the way I deliver them to any client. And nothing about this conversation gets discussed at Thanksgiving. Halloran's outside counsel, a sharp older attorney named Patricia Osei, who'd clearly seen every kind of workplace tension a boardroom could produce, watched this entire exchange without comment, and as the meeting wrapped, she caught me by the door and said quietly, just to me, whatever that was, you handled it like someone who bills by the hour and doesn't waste it. I'd want you on my team. It was a small thing, the kind of professional courtesy that costs a person nothing to offer, and it mattered more to me that week than almost anything my own family had said to me in 5 years. He agreed. Northline took the case. Over the following 6 weeks, my team pulled network logs going back 19 months, correlated them against badge access records for every employee with clearance to the formulation database, and built a timeline the way I've built 100 timelines before, hour by hour, access by access, discarding nothing until it was ruled out. Priya found the first real thread, a pattern of database queries run consistently at 60:40 in the evening, after most of the building had cleared out, always from the same workstation, always followed within 11 minutes by an outbound transfer to a personal cloud account. We traced that account to a mid-level supply chain analyst who had been selling proprietary formulas to a competitor for 14 months in exchange for consulting fees routed through a shell entity registered in a neighboring state. A pattern we confirmed through log correlation, badge access records, and a set of encrypted messages the analyst had, carelessly, kept on a company-issued laptop instead of a personal device, the way careless people in my line of work almost always do. The final number, once outside counsel finished their damage assessment, came to $2.3 million in projected losses. Halloran's board terminated the analyst, referred the matter to federal prosecutors, and paid Northline's invoice. $184,000 on time and in full, the way any professional client does when the work is done correctly. I want to tell you what happened 3 days after that invoice cleared, because this is the part where the leverage, finally, after 5 years, moved. My mother called me on a Thursday evening. I hadn't spoken to her in 11 days, which was not unusual by then, but there was something different in her voice, a carefulness I hadn't heard from her before, and she said, "Denise says Mark's company had you do some work for them." That's wonderful, honey. We didn't know you did such important things." I let a silence sit on the line. 17 seconds. I counted them, the way I count everything, and I did not rush to fill the gap the way I had spent 38 years filling gaps in that family's conversations. Finally, I said, "I've been doing important things for 5 years, Mom. You just never asked." She didn't have an answer for that. She changed the subject to whether I was coming to the 4th of July barbecue, and I told her I'd let her know, which was not a no, but it was also not the automatic yes I would have given a year earlier. I noticed, hanging up, that she hadn't asked a single question about the actual work, not what kind of company, not what the investigation had involved, not whether it had been hard. She'd absorbed exactly one fact, that it was important, the way you'd absorb a headline without reading the article, and I found myself thinking that this, more than anything Denise had ever said out loud, was the truest measure of how invisible I'd made myself over 5 years, and how much of that invisibility, if I was honest, I had built on purpose, brick by brick, because it was safer than being seen and dismissed anyway. Denise called 2 days after that. She did not apologize first. I want you to notice that because it tells you almost everything you need to know about how this ends for her. She opened with, "So, are we good? Because Mark said things got weird at that meeting and I don't want it to be like a whole thing." I told her I wasn't angry that Mark's company had needed a forensics firm. I told her exactly what I was angry about, and I said it once, the way I'd read a finding into the record, flat and dated. "You told my mother my success explained the townhouse, like it was a scandal instead of 6 years of 14-hour days. You told your aunt I'd like feeling important if you asked me for a favor, instead of just asking me, as a professional, the way Mark eventually had to. And 3 weeks before all of that, at Tommy's birthday party, you told a yard full of people I'm too difficult for any man to keep." That's the same sentence, Denise. You've said some version of it at every family gathering for 5 years. Boy, I counted. This was the 6th time. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing people say when the ledger gets read back to them and they don't have a defense ready. "God, Claire, it was a joke. You're being so sensitive about this all of a sudden. Is this because you're rich now or something? Because you never used to care this much." I didn't answer right away, and she kept going, the way people do when a silence makes them nervous instead of thoughtful. "I mean, everyone jokes around at family stuff. Mom laughs at Dad's jokes too. You've literally laughed along every single time, so I don't get why now, all of a sudden, 5 years later, this is some big thing. Is this like a therapy thing? Did someone tell you to say all this?" And there it is. The exact sentence thrown at me one more time, dressed up as a question about money instead of what it actually was, which was the same old accusation in a new outfit, that whatever I felt, whatever I'd earned, whatever I'd built, the real problem was still me. I told her, calmly, that I wasn't going to argue with her about whether 5 years of the same joke was a joke, and that I wasn't interested in explaining my own feelings to someone who'd never once asked what I did for a living before she needed something from it. I told her I would still come to family things, because I love my niece and nephew and because I am not interested in punishing children for their mother's choices. But I told her I would not be discussing Northline with her again, ever, in any context, professional or otherwise, and that if she or anyone else in the family needed my expertise going forward, they could hire Northline through normal business channels, at our standard rate, like anyone else's family would have had the decency to do from the start. I told her the one thing that could ever change that, the day she was ready to apologize without also asking why I was being so sensitive in the same breath, I'd listen. Until then, I wasn't interested in a version of peace that just asked me to go back to laughing at myself first. She hung up on me. That was 6 weeks ago. She has not called since. My father called me the following Sunday, which he has never once done in 38 years without my mother initiating it first. He said, "I should have said something at that wedding, 8 years ago, when she said that thing about you being too difficult. I remember thinking it wasn't right and I didn't say a word, and I've thought about that more than you'd probably believe." I let that sit for a moment before I answered. I told him I appreciated him saying it now, 6 years late, but that I wasn't ready to pretend 6 years of silence didn't happen just because he'd finally found the sentence for it. I told him we could talk more, slowly, if he wanted to actually be present going forward instead of just sorry about the past. He said he understood. We've talked 3 times since then. It's careful. It's not fixed. But it's real. In a way, nothing with Denise has been. I did go to the 4th of July barbecue in the end, 4 weeks after that call with Denise. My mother had clearly rehearsed something for the occasion, because when I walked in carrying a bowl of the potato salad I always bring, she met me at the door and said quietly, before anyone else could hear, "I looked up the dark reading article. All of it. I should have asked you what you did for a living years ago, instead of assuming I already knew the answer." I told her thank you, and I meant it. And I also told her that one article wasn't going to undo 11 repeated years of the same joke landing at the same table, and she nodded, like she'd expected that answer and had decided to accept it anyway. My father grilled that day the way he always had. Same tongs, same apron with a mustard stain from 3 summers ago, and at one point he caught my eye across the yard and gave me a small nod that meant more to me than anything he'd said on the phone. Denise came with the kids and stayed on the opposite side of the yard for most of the afternoon, and neither of us made it into a scene in front of my niece and nephew because that was never who this was about. Ro wasn't there. The drive is too far for her knees now, even with the stair lift, but she called that night at 6, same as always, and asked how the barbecue went. I told her the short version. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Your mother finally read the article, huh? Took her long enough." Then she laughed, the specific dry laugh she's had my whole life, and asked if I'd saved her any of that potato salad, which of course I had, because some things you learn to keep doing for people whether or not the world ever notices you're doing them. Ro, when I told her the whole story over Sunday dinner at her place, she still insists on cooking, even with the stairlift I never told her I paid for, just nodded slowly and said, "You are always the one keeping the receipts around here, Claire. I just didn't know you'd been keeping them on all of us." Then she asked if I wanted seconds of the pot roast, because to Ro, that was the whole conversation. That's what real family sounds like. If you've never had it, it doesn't need a big speech. It just keeps showing up, the same Wednesday, the same Sunday, the same stairlift nobody had to know about, for years, without ever once asking what it was owed. Wendy texted me the week after the 4th of July barbecue, just a simple message, "I heard some of what happened. I'm really glad you finally said something. I should have said more, that day by the cooler." I told her she didn't owe me a debt for one honest sentence at 22, but that I appreciated her saying it now, and I meant it. She's the one member of that extended family I've actually grown closer to since all of this, not because she did anything dramatic, but because she was the first person, years before any of the rest of them, who noticed the joke wasn't funny and said so out loud, even quietly, even just once. My life now, most weeks, looks nothing like a boardroom. It looks like Wednesday dinner with Ro, pot roast or a roast chicken depending on her hip that week, and a standing Friday happy hour with Priya and Deb where none of us are allowed to talk about work after the first round. It looks like Sunday afternoons with my niece and nephew when Denise drops them off at my parents' house and I stop by, because 6-year-olds and 9-year-olds have never once cared whether their aunt is married, only whether she'll play the card game they invented that has no actual rules. It looks like a quiet townhouse, paid for in full, that nobody had to co-sign for me. None of it is dramatic. All of it is mine, in a way nothing before Northline ever quite was. Last month, my nephew asked me, completely out of nowhere while we were playing his made-up card game on my kitchen floor, whether I was the boss of my own company, because he'd overheard his dad mention it once. Quote, I told him yes. He nodded, satisfied, the way 9-year-olds are satisfied by facts that don't require follow-up questions, and went right back to explaining a rule he'd apparently just invented on the spot that heavily favored his own hand. I thought, watching him lay his cards down with total confidence in a game only he understood, that this was the first time in 5 years someone in that family had simply believed me about my own life without needing a dark reading article to confirm it first. Northline crossed 31 employees this spring, and I'm still running it myself, because $11 million was never the number I was building toward. My mother still calls, more carefully than before. My father is trying, in small, specific ways I'm choosing to notice. Denise has not called, and I am, for the first time in 5 years, completely at peace with that particular silence. That's my story. 5 years, one weaponized joke, and a $184,000 invoice that finally made a family read my job title out loud. If you've ever been the family punchline, here's what I want you to take with you. The people who mock you for being too difficult are very rarely talking about your personality. They're talking about the fact that you stopped needing their approval before they were ready to lose that kind of power over you. Build the thing anyway. Keep the receipts anyway. You don't owe anyone the performance of staying small just because it's the only version of you they ever bothered learning. I think about that birthday party sometimes. The mimosa, the paper streamers, the bounce house Denise was still making payments on. She wanted a punchline that day. I gave her an invoice instead, 6 weeks later, and I didn't even have to hand it to her myself. Mark's own board did that part for me. I didn't build Northline to prove anything to a Cedar Hollow backyard. I built it because I was good at something nobody at that table ever thought to ask about. The proving part just happened to come free. Somebody, somewhere watching this, is sitting at a table right now where a joke has been repeated so many times it stopped sounding like a joke and started sounding like a verdict. I don't know your version of the mimosa, or the bounce house, or the 11 relatives laughing along, but I know the particular quiet of driving home afterward, replaying it, deciding not to say anything, and I know that quiet can either shrink you or build you. And the only difference between those two outcomes is what you do with the next 5 years while nobody's watching. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments what your version of too difficult was. The phrase they used on you, the one you're finally ready to stop apologizing for. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one about quiet reckonings and the families who never saw them coming, and I'll see you in the next one.